so today's topic is what can environmental history and the history of technology contribute to today's challenges, the global challenges, the challenges that we are currently discussing so much, and how. And I would like to briefly introduce to you the contributors. This is Heike Weber, a historian of technology and a historian of an environmental historian who's the chair of the history of technology and environmental history at Technical University Berlin. She has been a professor previously at the KIT in Karlsruhe and at the university, the Technical University in Wuppertal. The second presenter and discussant will be Julia Obertreis, who's a professor of Eastern European history and environmental history at Erlangen in Bavaria. And the third person to contribute is Tim Moss, who's working at the IRI-Thesis, a special research center devoted to technological, geographical, and other angles at Humboldt University Berlin, and he's also a professor at the University of Hanover. And Christoph Bernhardt, who's a professor at Humboldt University and at the and also works at the Center for Regional Studies and Regional Planning in Erkner, one of the Leibniz institutes. The four of them got together to organize this this series and also organize this panel today, and they have selected 3 questions, and the procedure today will be that we'll have 3 or 4 inputs on each question by the discussants, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience. The goal today is really to discuss with you all, because you all do research and have had exposure and have had experience of engaging with the public and of trying to contribute with public agendas and current affairs. And so we're very, very happy and very interested in your contributions and your views on these issues. So the goal is not really that the speakers on the table will say the last word on what is to be said on these questions, but it's really that we want to engage with you all, even though that we know that this is difficult in an online format. On the other hand, we'll have a very broad and international audience today, and so we are very much looking forward. Without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce to you the first question, which is: what selective or simplistic histories of the environment permeate the thinking of policymakers, business leaders, and opinion setters, and how can they be challenged by historians? We've all encountered this, that there are so many narratives and stories out there of the environment that are informed by people's interests, and we always look at them and find that, let's take a second look and let's engage with that. So I will first give the word to Heike for her view on this issue.
Well, thank you. And thank you also for this introduction. So as historian of technology, who's also doing environmental history, I really want to concentrate more on simplistic histories and ideas of technological development. And as we all know, and as we share a common understanding of envirotech histories, we know environment and technology are closely shaping each other. I'm also simplifying at this point. I think there can be a lot of things can be said on this. And I also might be repeating what we already said in this mini-series. In particular, I want to mention Per's input, who kicked off this mini-series. So I have 4 points that I want to make on simplistic narrative, simplistic histories on technological development. And the first one is this very simple-minded idea of causes that then result in certain technologies as solution, what we term the technological fix. So history of technology is full of these stories that demonstrate that technological developments are never just a solution to certain problems, but novel technologies generate, for example, unforeseen, even unforeseeable effects and consequences. Just think of mass motorization. Nobody thought when Ford invented the car, he didn't think about the problem of emissions caused by fossil-fueled cars. Or if we think about digitalization came up with the vision that it would dematerialize our culture and technologies. But what we now experience is that tons of stuff are needed to produce a chip, a laptop, tiny things, but you need a really huge mass of materials. They have negative environmental consequences, and any data is in need of data centers that consumes a lot of energy in that. So what I just want to highlight with this is that also our current challenges, the way they are discussed among policymakers, are often seen in a very technological fixed mind. And we forget that things will develop differently. So that is really a main message where I think we as historians of technology and environmental historians, we need to confront simplistic histories of policymakers and business leaders, that there is no technological fix. And maybe there's technology there to fix certain problems, but also society has to change. And history of technology is full of these co-shaping of society, technology, culture, and the environment. So another simplification, I think, is really represented by metaphors that govern our thinking, even our own thinking. And I just wanted to mention a few. I recently worked on the Technikwende as concept. And the Technikwende is the German wording for what we need to do in our current challenging situation. We need to change radically our technologies. Now, if we look into energy history, for example, we'll see that there never was a rapid change in technology. There was no full substitution, for example, of wood or solar-based fuels by coal. Rather, old and new technologies were added upon each other. They existed in parallel, and old technologies were reshaped by novel and needs of the society. So this leads me to another simplification, namely that we often use a very polar thinking, even in histories. Less so in current history of technology, but in general history, we often have this, namely, for example, the polar thinking of old and new technologies and the new technology substituting the old one, which is never true. As, for example, David Everton and others have hinted to the fact that we have never consumed more coal than nowadays, and we consider many regions nowadays heading into a post-fossil society. So even now we use a lot of old technologies. And next to this dualism on old, new, I see, this is my last point, another dual thinking, which is really problematic, namely that we are mostly led by the idea that a technology is either good or evil. Nuclear energy in Germany is evil, for example. Somewhere else in other countries, it might be good. It has been 50 years ago that the historian of technology, Melvin Kranzberg, has phrased his so-called laws on the history of technology. And one law among these laws were technology is neither good nor evil, but never neutral. And I think this message by now is well known in the discipline of history of technology, but not really beyond the boundaries. As stated, it has been phrased some decades ago, which leads me to my kind of message. Namely, there's still a lot to do for historians of technology to confront simplistic narratives with our rather complex stories, that, for example, there's no technological fix, and that we should be careful with using simplistic metaphors or catchwords, and that we should avoid framing technology in easy ways, such as simplistic ways, such as old and new and bad and evil. But this is a complex thing, and it's also messages that often people don't want really to hear, because we offer complexity instead of simple stories.
Simple stories are so much more fun. Julia has simple and complex stories to tell. I think Julia wants to draw on examples, right?
Yeah, important things have already been said by Heike. Thank you. And I would like to add something from my own research. My second book is on Central Asia, on irrigation and cotton growing. And much, oh, thank you, showing the book. And much of what has been done in terms of realization of these grand schemes of irrigation and cotton growing was done in the Soviet period. But I argue in the book that in terms of the patterns of thought that are behind that, for example, we need to become independent of cotton imports from other countries, or, for example, and most importantly, we shouldn't we are not obliged to keep some water from the big rivers in the region, the Amu-Darya and the Sir-Darya, to flow into the Aral Sea, but we can spend all this water on irrigation and on man's needs. And this is expressed in the 19th century already, in the colonial period. Southern Central Asia was conquered by the Russian Empire from the 1860s. And these ideas existed since the late 19th century. But in the literature, you often have the impression is conveyed that this whole catastrophe of the Aral Sea drying up, of the desiccation of the Aral Sea, is solely a Soviet thing. And it's often attributed to the Soviet kind of dealing with environmental resources, with the water and other resources, with Soviet management and so on, especially, of course, in Western literature. And if you just broaden the horizon in terms of chronology, you can see that it's, in terms of the basic patterns of thinking, it had been established well before the Soviet period. And I think that's an important finding. So I remember that Per Högselius spoke about zooming out when we are asked about comments on some issues. As historians, we can zoom out and provide more context and make things more complicated, in fact. And here it's a kind of zooming out in chronological terms. And if you provide a longer history and a longer perspective, you can have a different view on things. I could make some other points, but I think this is an important one, and I will just keep it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. I think that's important to also point to the politics of it and to the political element of these narratives. And I think Tim has more to say to these narratives and trajectories. So I'm Tim.
Yeah, well, just picking up from the point that that Julia was making just now about the sort of the importance of a long-term perspective, and that's just what I did with my latest book on Berlin and Berlin's infrastructure history the last 100 years. And that long-term perspective actually challenged a lot of assumptions that we have, a lot of simplistic histories that are out there that I'd like to talk about just briefly now. And there are sort of three simplistic histories that I've been problematizing in my book. And the first one are these master narratives about large technical systems, these narratives about the sort of the progress to, or the development of a dominant technical system that we readily recognize today from the early phases of emergence, the consolidation, fighting off opponents and so on, and the sort of the perfection of it now. And that's a narrative that's very prominent, not only amongst civil engineers, of course, but even from sort of the early days of history of technology, Tom Hughes's analysis and so on. And basically what my research of Berlin's infrastructure history has shown, amongst other things, is how this narrative ignores or shuts out a huge degree of technological diversity, let alone the sort of socio-technical and political turbulence involved there. So it closes down and shuts out sort of alternative technological pathways around sort of sewage gas, around different forms of energy generation, around different forms of competing for ways of using sewage and so on. It also tends to ignore the fact that these mature systems in practice are actually much more dynamic and much more volatile than we like to think that they, or conventionally we think that they are. These techno-political framings are very, very important. That's obviously the very important message for nowadays, to think of this political framing of technology today. And also something I uncovered in terms of the master narratives challenged is about the sort of, I call it the unruly consumer. That's the fact that the consumer is not playing this comfortable role as the passive and grateful recipient of these wonderful services, but actually is getting quite stroppy. And that's not just a product of the environmentalism from the 70s onwards, but you can find traces of that back in the past. And yeah, the Berlin utilities are finding that, the legacy of that, to their cost at the moment, the remunicipalization campaigns. The second point I want to make is, which is kind of related to that, is this simplistic notion of linear trajectories of technological progress. So this idea of moving from one stage to the next, and that tends to close down any notion of ruptures or diversions or reversals even. So there's an interesting example of early sewage treatment plants being introduced in the late 1920s, early 1930s. They're actually getting reversed both in the Nazi era and in the state socialist era of East Germany for political and ideological reasons. So that sort of notion, and yet that's written out of history. Yeah, it's these sewage treatment plants are regarded as a progressive technology that are sort of that are then taken up in the 50s and 60s. So those kind of linear trajectories tend to blend out, tend to close down discussions of broader societal contexts, and also the contingent events, of course, that have influenced them. And then finally, and this is drawing very much on sort of the point that Heike was referring to, the sort of fetishizing innovation, this notion of looking to innovation for change and overlooking the existence of persistent and long-term older systems, and seeing them not just as a kind of transitional phase on the way out, as Heike was nicely saying with coal, but actually this coexistence is part of everyday reality. This coexistence is the norm. It isn't an exceptional state from the transition from one socio-technical regime to another socio-technical regime. So I think there are some wonderful examples in Berlin's history of the coexistence of the old and the new right up to this day. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Tim. That reminds me of a talk I listened to last week by Jean-Baptiste Fressot at the Centre Marc Bloch here in Berlin, and he was actually tracing the history of this idea of transition and that replacement of the one and the other. He had wonderful graphs that showed how until the 50s one was clearly aware of the addition of the different energy regimes, and then he found that this was replaced by ideas of particularly nuclear replacing all the other things. So this is a really important debate, and you can look at it from various angles. Christoph wants to tell some more of what can be challenged. So I'm very curious on what Christoph has to say.
Thank you. Being an urban and environmental historian, I am very much interested with regard to the first question on experiences, best practices, cases where historians really successfully challenged these simplistic histories in public debates. What experience do we have? Where do we see cases that we can learn from? And I was reminded on the case of the famous Berlin Mietskaserne tenement houses, where we can see how a certain stereotype on a building, in this case, which was accused to be responsible as a material construction for social problems, for problems of hygiene and disease. This stereotype was successfully contested in the 1970s and 80s by a group of urban historians who showed the multifunctionality of these buildings, the value for current uses, and they contributed substantially to a redirection of the public debate. And that's, as I said, is a question that I'm interested in. But in looking more in detail on who was it who successfully worked on that and contested these stories, it wasn't academic historians working in history departments. It were sociologists, historians of art, etc., who were working in departments of planning and architecture. So they had different conditions and they were more successful, and they were also doing a different type of research. So I'm asking myself, what limits do we have as academic historians, or what can we learn from them eventually? And drawing a little bit more on my own research on water history, I just want to briefly mention one famous simplistic story, that is the story of heroes, great engineers in water management. I was doing research on a famous called Tulla water engineer in southern West Germany, and there we see this is really very, let's say, widespread stereotype, and if and I hope to have contributed to this, and we find this stereotype really even in recent environmental histories. I don't want to mention names of colleagues, but deconstructing these histories reveals as one result, water management and changes in the landscape as a collective practice and desire instead of a master narratives, of a masterpiece narrative. So this would be a kind of practical example that I would like to raise. Thank you.
So now it's time for all to contribute to the debate. And I should have said that I should have told you how to raise your hand or write into the chat what you would
Jan
like.
Henrik,
Yeah.
I think we agreed before we would do all the questions one after the other, because because we're recording this session now, and when we come to the big discussion, we would stop the recording.
Okay, I had it in mind differently. So it's then we continue. Then we continue with question number 2, and I would like to start with Julia, who has a particular view on the question, which is what legacies from the past, institutional, cultural, political, socio-economic, material, constrain action and restrict options for addressing the climate and environmental crisis that we are so concerned with. And today's judgment in the Netherlands illustrates that quite nicely. Conversely, what inspirations from the past could enrich our response to climate and environmental change? And Julia has some of these inspirational points to make here. So I would like to start with her.
Okay, thank you. So we will start with inspiration and then go to the more problematic aspects. It's okay. I would like to talk about positive examples from environmental history, because I think that they can serve as inspirations for deeds and thoughts in the present. And I mean, we are talking here about public debates. Of course, a seminar group is a small public sphere, but still, I think it's a small but important public sphere. And when I look at my students, in my research, I am focused on the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. But in my teaching, I do environmental history very broadly, including German environmental history, European, and even some global. Just last term, in the winter term, I had a course on environmental history, and I very strongly felt that students, they don't have a positive outlook, at least these students. They are very pessimistic about the future. They have the image that mankind has always damaged nature and will go on doing so, and there's nothing we can do about it. They don't really have a sense of agency. And I try to counteract this in a way by referring to positive examples where some things have changed in the past, and things have gotten better indeed. And one of the well-known examples is the reduction of ozone depletion. Some of us, the elder ones, remember this time, 70s, 80s, much talk about ozone depletion, the thinning of the ozone layer in the atmosphere as a result of the growing emission of halocarbons, and being afraid of skin cancer, the danger of enhanced UVB radiation. This was counteracted on the international level by the Montreal Protocol from 1987, which banned the production of these chemicals, these ozone depleting chemicals. And as a result, the ozone levels stabilized and even began to recover. It is still a long way to go, and some people write that they will continue to recover to the pre-1980 level until 2070. So this is a period of 100 years. But still, I think it's a positive example. In analyzing this example, authors have written about how did it come and so on. I cannot go on here in detail. I want to mention that Don McNeil, who seems to be also present, hello, wrote that it was lucky that UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, already existed at that time and took the lead in brokering international agreements. So this is one positive example, and I want to give another one. And this is the quality of the water in the river Rhine. Our expert for the Rhine is Christoph Bernhardt, not me, but I hope you will agree when I say that from the 1970s, many forms of pollution were restricted and reduced, and that led to heavy metal concentrations declining quite sharply from the 70s, and also fish populations rising. The German Minister of the Environment, Klaus Töpfer, swam the Rhine. He crossed the Rhine swimming in 1988 in order to prove that the water would do him no harm. And when he came out, he allegedly had red eyes, but still he was alive and kicking. And that was his way to prove that that the water has gotten much cleaner and that everything was improving. And that was, by the way, not the only example of politicians and ministers making themselves into a kind of crash test dummies in environmental issues. There's also the famous, interesting case of the Bavarian Minister of the Environment, Alfred Dick, who 1 year after the Chernobyl accident ate a few grams of radiated milk powder and said, "Es tut mir nix." That doesn't do me any harm. And he also wanted to prove, that all these anxieties about radiation after Chernobyl were exaggerated. So the improvement of the water quality in the Rhine and the Montreal Protocol are two examples of successful environmental acting on different levels, on the national level and on different national levels in terms of the Rhine, and on international, even global level in terms of the Montreal Protocol. And I think it can be important to stress and teach these positive examples. Thank you.
Yeah, and now we can all go spitting into the soup of the Montreal Protocol, which obviously also benefited from the fact that there were chemical alternatives available, particularly in the US, so that the US was able to support this. And the Rhine is the Rhine is a fascinating example because it was scandals of Rhine pollution that also kicked off the European Parliament's interest and the push for environmental policy in the European Union. So that, but the story about politicians making themselves fools, trying to demonstrate environmental improvements and the lack of harm, that I think is a different category of environmental histories that should be written about more closely. And I'm not sure whether that's a positive or a negative or just a curious message. But
I just wanted to add it for entertainment.
No, these are fun stories. These are fun stories. That's almost as good as Boris Johnson wanting to get infected on television. Anyways, talking about British people, Tim, and path dependencies.
Okay, thanks for the nice lead in there, Boris Johnson. But I mean, yes, to bring a more jaundiced view to these things, I'll start off with the negative legacies or the constraining legacies I put, again, based on some findings from my book. And I think in terms of, attempts to decarbonize Berlin, I mean, one of the messages coming out of my studies is that is going to be problematized, constrained by the heavy dependence of the city, or both halves of the city, east and west, on fossil fuels for generating electricity, but also for producing gas in the past. And it's more recent than in many cities, thanks to the geopolitics of the Cold War, and particularly in West Berlin, where, owing to its policy of autarky for producing its own electricity and its own town gas right up until the late 1980s. That has left a massive legacy of lots of infrastructures that are still in place and partly operable now that need decommissioning and reconnecting to other areas. But of course, also in East Berlin, that was heavily dependent on a national energy policy, very dependent on lignite mines from the Lausitz. So for two reasons there's a very strong legacy of dependency on fossil fuels that are not often referred to when people are talking about decarbonizing Berlin today. And there's not much reflection on that kind of contextual context, both of a technical, physical, material, but also of an institutional, political, that very much frames that approach there. And that brings me on to the second sort of negative legacy, which I think is a disregard for the region's environment or the environment of the surrounding region. And I think that you can see that very clearly as a kind of product of the urban fetishism, you could say, or the kind of introspective urbanism that was characteristic certainly since the 1920s of Berlin, which is very much turning in on itself, the larger Greater Berlin, and ignoring or regarding the surrounding region very much as a sink and a source. And disregarding any kind of concerns about the environmental impacts or even indeed the socio-economic impacts of their infrastructure systems. This obviously became quite extreme in the Cold War in West Berlin, where the insularity of the supply system again not only reconfigured the physical infrastructures, but created a mindset about not thinking about the surrounding region when you're thinking about infrastructure systems that I think you can see traces of very clearly today. And up to today, I think it's no coincidence at all that cooperation between the states of Berlin and Brandenburg over energy policy is notoriously bad, and has been since 1990. I think that is not a coincidence, and showing up the historical roots of that difficulty is very, very important. I see a trend now towards a more regional approach, but that needs to be aware of this strong introspective urbanism in the past. And the final negative one is really the sort of persistence of this build and supply logic that's so familiar to infrastructure researchers. This idea of that, you build up your infrastructure and don't worry, because there'll always be new demand that will take up any kind of slack in the infrastructure system, whether it's a telecommunications cable, whether it's railways, whether it's electricity cables or sewers. And the amazing thing, that really rode across multiple political regimes in Berlin. That you see the supply, the build and supply logic in the Weimar Republic, the Nazi era, state socialism, West Berlin, up to the reunification. Indeed, the reunification, I argue in my book that this build and supply logic was one way of winning over the Eastern utilities and Eastern infrastructure planners and making the bitter pill of amalgamation sweeter by promising them lots of investment in the system, in the idea of the build and supply logic, which of course means if that's so powerful, if it's crossed so many regimes, then actually kicking that logic in the idea of degrowth or reordering our infrastructure systems to do more with less is going to be a real challenge. Okay, but I will finish on a more positive note. And one of the more sort of sources of inspiration that I still think is really pretty amazing is the collaboration that you see in the 1920s, partly also in the 1950s in West Berlin, between utilities, between city politicians and city bureaucrats over using infrastructure systems not as mundane providers of basic services, that's the easy part, but enrolling them in very complex and ambitious urban policy objectives, whether it was about housing, whether it's about the local economy, whether it was about social equity. In those days, obviously, they weren't talking much about the environment at all. And this ability to see infrastructure as performing much wider tasks than what we normally associate them with is something that was absolutely critical. And you see sort of indications of that in the remunicipalization campaign today, talking about infrastructure systems or utility services being more accountable, environmentally sustainable and socially acceptable and so on. But that's not something that's really taken off, not being recognized by city politicians and city bureaucrats, let alone by utility directors themselves. This is coming sort of out of the box, basically. And so I think it's very inspirational to look back to some certain selective eras in the past where there was a kind of a notion of a common cause for a greater ideal, or greater ideals that went far beyond common notions of basic services for electricity, gas, water, or whatever. Okay.
Heike, have you made up your mind whether you see more legacies overwhelming us, or whether you see more inspirations that put a positive spin on what we can encourage our students and our listeners and our audiences to actually see?
So actually, my final comments really rather belong to question 3. So I will not contribute to this specific question.
Okay.
We agreed to not really, because we also want a discussion with all of us later on.
So we're looking forward to your points on number 3. And so Christoph has the last word on this question.
Yeah, only 2 brief remarks. As to the question of inspirations, I like the concept of slow hope that Christoph Mauch developed. So Heike did mention in our internal debate, and that's a good idea, good concept to draw inspiration for current debates. But I want to share another observation that I have in mind. It is a bit strange that urban planners and urban and landscape planners and other practitioners are discussing and are mobilizing a lot of historical arguments. They are even developing utopian and real landscape designs with reference to historic conditions. So there's a struggle on what Sigmund Baumann, the sociologist, critically calls retrotopia. And that's a little bit far from the question that is here in a more practical sense, but the question of historicity, let's say, thinking to the future, mobilizing historical arguments, that is the basic question that I see here too. That was all.
Audio technology is difficult sometimes, but Heike has already told us that she has clear views on question number 3, which I will read out to you, which is what risks do historians need to be aware of when engaging with contemporary debates on environmental or climate policy and practice?
Yeah, so it's less talking on risks, but talking on personal challenges and ideas for inspirations for positive narratives, such as slow hope, which has already been mentioned. So I think actually the point on risks and pitfalls, if historians engage in current debates, is being widely discussed nowadays. For example, the German have called this trend of history the gegenwartsorientierte Geschichtsschreibung, so a history which is oriented towards and framed by current challenges and questions. So let me really more specifically refer to history of technology and what personally is really troubling myself when I write history of technology. And actually, I don't have answers. I really have more questions. So let me begin with some specific words on history of technology. So in my eyes, actually, the current developments in our quite technological world force the discipline of history of technology to really reflect about our narratives and concepts, which we have been using so far. Thomas Park-Hughes, for example, has been mentioned with large technological systems, because all of these concepts, which we are commonly using, they have been developed under conditions of really radical different technologies in the past, along past technologies. Scott, the social construction of technology, for example, has been had as cases mechanical bikes and electric neon lighting. But processes such as the ongoing digitalization, globalization, or the condition which has recently been called the Anthropocene, they really demand new questions, new narratives, new concepts. I think we are along on our way to develop these new narratives, but it's not settled as our old concepts are already when we talk of Scott, of LTS, and all these concepts. So I really think we need to adapt. We need to get new tools. And that is actually what Martina Hessler and I have called the provocation for history of technology, Provokation der Technikgeschichte. Not only do we provocate like the public with our complex stories, but also we as historians of technology, we are really kind of being troubled by these developments and don't have answers yet, at least in my eyes. Secondly, I think as historians of technology and environmental history, we often have uncomfortable messages. We heard some positive messages, like the narrative on the Rhine getting cleaner. One of the uncomfortable messages is clearly, in my eyes, the complexity of a story that we tell, because simple stories, if you say, well, we have an industry 4.0 out there, thinking in the stages of technological development, all that, that's what the public really receives better than complex stories. The heroes like Tulla, they are still searched after. Musk is a hero, but not really if we tell, you know, how the unruly consumers have shaped history of technology. Yet we need to tell these complex stories. The other point on these uncomfortable messages is that we often necessarily, in my eyes, have declensionist narratives. We heard about the Rhine getting cleaner, but I'm, for example, not so sure about the CFC story, the ozone hole story, because the CFCs that we have already produced, they'll stay 100 years. And we as historians know that's quite a large time span. And if you look into the details of that substitution, the first substitute which was chosen was not a good one at all. And they had to reflect again and get another substitute, because what they decided back then was not a disruptive path of technology, but rather continuing with this kind of chemicals instead of really thinking anew about how do we do cooling technology. So in my eyes, this story is not so green, not so successful as has been described. And I really want to remind us of the history of climate policies. You probably all know the popular book by the writer Nathaniel Rich with the title Losing Earth, the decade we almost stopped climate change. And that decade has been the 1970s. And he's really describing how climate scientists got together, how they communicated the problems of CO2 emissions, and really got politicians to think about it, but then never something happened because, well, they just decided we still have some time. We don't need fast solutions and things like that. So indeed, also in my history on recycling, for example, and waste, I see all discussions of the 70s and later on being rediscussed time and again, and the solutions are still not there. Like even the grassroots driven movements such as the recycling movement at first sight really sounds like a success. We have recycling now around, and yes, it is making our consumption greener, but still, if you look not in the short-term perspective, but take the larger time span, the longue durée, and recycling then really didn't change anything to the great acceleration as it has been described by 20th century environmental history. Indeed, Germans are producing more waste, once recycling has been introduced than ever up to today. So we are masterful in recycling, but we are still very, very masterful in producing more and more waste. So actually, I'm a bit frustrated because I'm confronted with many of these declensionist narratives where I don't really see where my unruly consumers or other actors had enough agency to really change, radically change the situation. So my last point is, we historians, we are experts on long time scales, and energy historians, for example, have reminded us on the point that technological developments have never really been so disruptive as we nowadays imagine our disruptive situation for the upcoming technologies, for the Energiewende, for the Mobilitätswende and all that. Energy historians have underlined how long it took to establish or to modify everyday practices of heating, of cooking, of taking a warm bath, and so on. So even introducing new practices took quite some time. And if asked about moments in the past of rapid change, most of us historians often lack inspiration, and we refer to moments of crisis and moments of war. And that is really, I think, we need to think about that. We need to get our stories in there. For example, history lacks histories of unmaking and histories of exnovation, like, for example, taking out the CVCs from products in industry and in consumer products. So histories of how do we get rid of technologies? Maybe do we have moments of disruptive technology changes in the past, and how have we unmade certain technologies, if so at all? I mean, as we just underlined, what mostly we find in history of technology is adding old and new, piling it up and modifying, but not really substituting. So to sum up, I'm really, I'm really questioned by the question how to frame our narratives so that they inspire us to find better solution. And I'm not convinced by the slow hope, because I really think we need a fast hope. We need fast changes, because we are experts on time scales. And if it takes us 100 years or so, it's just a lot of time that we might not have. And I'll stop here.
We'll all be fried up anyway. I think Julia has views. Thank you, Heike. That was, I think that was very thorough engagement with the issue of risk. Julia has a very different take of risk that she has encountered.
To answer this question, I would like to tell you a little anecdote. I try to be brief. This was when we had a meeting about 2 years ago by representatives of the city of Erlangen, where my university is situated, and representatives of the city of Vladimir in Russia. And these two towns are sister cities, and there's a long story going back to the 1980s of partnership, exchange, and so on. And we do a discussion club every year on different topics. And 2 years ago, we had the topic environment, especially waste, Heike. And I was giving a presentation, short presentation, 20-30 minutes, on history of the environment in West Germany and Germany, and the history of the Green Party, just for our Russian partners to let them know. And in this little survey history, I mentioned the Waldsterben debate. Waldsterben is also translated as forest dieback, but it's also used in the English language. I looked this up, Waldsterben, the dying of the forests. this was a huge issue in the German public, in the West German public in the early 80s. And it is connected to sulfur dioxide, acid rain, and so on. And I said in my presentation that mass media highlighted this debate very much, or even dramatized it. And after my presentation, I was criticized from the Russian side as one representative of the city of Vladimir, who's like from the state organs, and he said that this was not really a history of the environment, but it was rather a history of the Green Party. And from the Erlangen side, two men in their late 50s criticized me sharply for having said exactly this, that the mass media very much contributed to this Waldsterben debate. And they said if it hadn't been such a coverage in the media, then the laws wouldn't have been invented that prevented more damage of the forests. And they even accused me of not consciously, but unconsciously adopting an argument of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, a right-wing extremist party in Germany, who say that climate change is not really existing and that it's made up by the media, by the mass media. So, and that was, of course, not what I wanted to do, to have such an argument. But after all this, I thought, okay, first I have to look up the literature on the Waldsterben, which I did, and I found that I was right at this point. And the second thing is just to be aware of political constellations of this kind and political perceptions. And I think this is a very important point to keep in mind. I wouldn't draw the conclusion from this to not participate in such discussions in the future, but I would rather say, okay, I will participate again, but you have to be aware of people's different reactions and what kind of arguments you might serve or how they perceive that you serve their arguments. So I found it very interesting experience after all. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very common risk, that you tell a story and the listeners read something completely different into this, and I think that's a general problem of communicating with the public. But I think even our students read the wildest things into what we're telling them sometimes. That said, Christoph has the last word on this risky question.
I thought Tim was still coming, but okay. Yeah, I just want to share two experiences which show risks. The first is I've been invited long ago to take part in two scientific boards. One was of Berlin Senate for public transport, and the other was of regional water board in Paris. And both invited me to contribute with historical expertise to current problems and decision-making and future scenario debates, and I couldn't contribute very much, so we didn't come in contact. So it was frustrating, and I was useless in a way. So my point is, I'm, as for the first question, interested in the reflection on arenas and roles, and there are some risky arenas and some, let's say, disappointing roles that you and experience that you have. And another problem might be that in public debates, the community of historians, of academic historians, in a way expects that you are limiting yourself on your professional expertise. So shifting to the role of a public intellectual who in a way goes beyond his academic expertise with some statements can be risky. So some colleagues have been strongly criticized for doing this. And yeah, that's a slippery ground where you have to reflect what you want to risk and not. Thank you.
Yeah, I overlooked a point that Tim was intending to make, and so I think Tim should have the last word on this.
I didn't really want to comment at all on this, but I think you're playing to a quotation that I'm referring to about the kind of political and social construction of what a usable past is. And I think,
exactly.
Yep, okay, so I'll take up that baton and then I'll stop talking. And that basically is Karen Morin's very, very poignant reference to the fact when we're talking about usable past, usable for whom and for what end or purpose is really, really important. So when we're talking about remembering, the productive remembering of a past, you know, who's determining what is being remembered to what end and for whom? And that is in terms of the kind of political construction of histories, that's always very important to bear in mind. Could we talk about a usable past as if we know what that means? It sounds very benign, but it is, of course, it can be heavily politically instrumentalized. But that's the only point I want to make